Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional stories that touch hearts around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of the old city as Captain James Morrison stood at his post outside the grand courthouse. His polished boots gleamed in the early light and his Royal Guard uniform was pressed to perfection. After 20 years of service, James had become a fixture at the courthouse, known for his stern dedication and unwavering commitment to duty. The courthouse was a majestic building with tall columns and wide marble steps that led to massive wooden doors. Every day, hundreds of people passed through these doors seeking justice, resolution, or simply answers to their troubles. James had seen them all. Wealthy businessmen in expensive suits, elderly couples holding hands nervously, young lawyers clutching their briefcases with determination. But nothing in his 2 decades of service could have prepared him for what would happen on this particular Tuesday morning. The streets were beginning to fill with the usual morning rush. Cars honked in the distance, and the smell of fresh bread from the nearby bakery drifted through the air. James adjusted his cap and checked his watch. It was 8:15 in the morning, and the courthouse would open its doors in exactly 15 minutes. That was when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold, a child crying. Not the usual tantrum of a spoiled youngster or the whimper of a tired toddler. This was different. This was the cry of someone in genuine pain and distress. James turned his head sharply, searching for the source of the sound. His trained eyes scanned the morning crowd, looking past the business people hurrying to work and the street vendors setting up their stalls. Then he saw her, a small girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, stumbling along the sidewalk about 50 meters away. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her dark hair tangled and matted, but it was the way she moved that alarmed James the most. She was limping badly, clutching her side, and leaving a trail of small blood drops on the pavement behind her. Without hesitation, James broke protocol. He left his post and ran toward the child, his heavy boots pounding against the stone street. Other pedestrians had noticed the girl too, but they kept their distance, unsure of what to do, or perhaps too afraid to get involved. In a big city, people often looked the other way when trouble appeared. James reached the girl just as her legs gave out beneath her. He caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her small frame in his strong arms. Up close, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Her face was pale, almost gray, and covered in bruises. Her left eye was swollen shut, and there was a deep gash on her forehead that was bleeding steadily. Her thin shirt was stained with blood. When James gently touched her side where she had been clutching, she cried out in pain. The girl looked up at James with her one good eye, and he saw something there that broke his heart. It was not just pain or fear, it was determination. This child had fought through whatever had happened to her to get here, to this specific place. The courthouse James quickly assessed the situation. The girl needed medical attention immediately, but she also needed to be somewhere safe. His military training kicked in, and he made a decision. He would take her inside the courthouse, where there were security, medical supplies, and people who could help. He could call for an ambulance from there. He lifted the girl carefully, making sure not to cause her more pain, and turned back toward the courthouse. The child weighed almost nothing in his arms, and James felt a surge of anger at whoever had done this to her. As he climbed the marble steps, the courthouse doors opened, and the head of security, Marcus, appeared. Marcus was a good man who had worked alongside James for over 10 years. When he saw James carrying the injured child, his face immediately shifted from confusion to concern. He held the door open wide and called out for someone to bring the first aid kit and call for medical help. Inside the grand entrance hall of the courthouse, people stopped and stared as James carried the girl through. The morning light streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust particles in the air and making the scene feel almost surreal. James laid the girl down gently on a wooden bench near the security desk, removing his jacket to place under her head as a pillow. The girl's breathing was shallow and rapid. Her small body trembled, whether from cold, pain, or fear, James could not tell. Probably all three. A female security officer named Sarah rushed over with a blanket and the first aid kit. She had children of her own, and immediately began to carefully clean the wound on the girl's forehead while speaking to her in a soft, soothing voice. James knelt beside the bench, holding the girl's small hand. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm morning. He could hear Marcus on the phone in the background, urgently requesting an ambulance and explaining the situation to the emergency services. The girl's eye fluttered open again, focusing on James's face. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but no sound came out. James leaned closer, his ear near her mouth. He could feel her breath, weak and uneven, against his cheek. Then she spoke, just barely above a whisper, but loud enough for James to hear clearly. What she said made his entire body go rigid with shock. The girl whispered a name that James recognized immediately, a name that belonged to one of the most powerful and respected judges in the entire city, Judge Harold Whitmore, the man who was known throughout the legal community as fair, honorable, and beyond reproach. The man whose courtroom was on the third floor of this very building. But it was not just the name that shocked James. It was what the girl said after the name. It made the blood drain from his face, and his mind race with impossible thoughts. The girl whispered those haunting words again, making sure James understood. Her voice was weak but clear with conviction. She said that Judge Harold Whitmore was her father, that he had kept her locked in the basement of their home for the past 3 years. James felt his world tilt. He had served at this courthouse for 2 decades. He had seen Judge Whitmore nearly every working day for the past 15 years since the judge had been appointed to the bench. The man was a pillar of the community, known for his harsh sentences against child abusers and his passionate speeches about protecting the innocent. He had received awards from children's charities and was frequently interviewed on television about justice and morality. Sarah, the female security officer who was tending to the girl's wounds, had heard the whispered confession too. She looked at James with wide eyes full of disbelief and horror. Marcus, who was still on the phone with emergency services, had not heard what the girl said, but he could tell from the expressions on his colleagues' faces that something significant had just happened. James struggled to process the information. Part of him wanted to dismiss it immediately. Children sometimes said strange things when they were traumatized or in shock. Perhaps the girl was confused. Perhaps she had hit her head and her memory was jumbled. But when he looked into her eye, that one visible eye that stared at him with such intensity, he saw no confusion there. He saw only truth and desperate hope that finally someone would believe her. The girl continued speaking in fragments between gasps of pain. She told James that her name was Emily Whitmore. She said she had an older brother named Thomas who had run away from home 5 years ago and nobody had ever found him. She spoke of a mother who had died when Emily was very young, too young to remember her face clearly. Emily explained that 3 years ago, when she was only 6 years old, her father had begun to change. After her mother's death, he had remarried a woman named Victoria. Victoria was beautiful and charming in public, but behind closed doors, she was cruel. When Emily had tried to tell her father about Victoria's treatment, about the times Victoria had hit her or locked her in her room without food, her father had not believed her. He said Emily was lying to cause trouble because she did not accept her new mother. Then one day, Emily had threatened to tell her teacher at school about what was happening at home. That night, Judge Whitmore had come into her room after she had fallen asleep. He had carried her down to the basement, to a small room that had been hidden behind a false wall. He told her that she was a bad girl who told lies, and until she learned to be good and accept Victoria as her mother, she would stay in that room. Emily described the basement room in heartbreaking detail. It was small, perhaps 3 meters by 3 meters, with no windows. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and a single dim light bulb that hung from the ceiling. The walls were concrete and always cold to the touch. Her father had soundproofed the room, so no matter how loud she screamed, nobody could hear her. For 3 years, Emily had lived in that basement room. Victoria would bring her food once a day, usually just bread and water, sometimes a piece of fruit or some cold soup. She was allowed to use the bathroom upstairs only twice a day, always when there was no chance of anyone seeing her. She had no books, no toys, no television. Just darkness and silence, and the endless passage of time marked only by the delivery of meals and the changing of the bucket. Judge Whitmore would visit her occasionally. It's always late at night. He would sit on a chair outside the hidden room and talk to her through the small opening in the door. He would ask her if she was ready to be good, if she was ready to stop telling lies about Victoria. Emily had begged and pleaded and promised she would be good, but he always said she was not ready yet. He said he could see the defiance still in her eyes. James listened to all of this with a growing sense of horror and rage. Sarah had tears streaming down her face as she continued to gently tend to Emily's injuries. The girl's small body was covered in old scars and fresh bruises. Now that they looked carefully, they could see the signs of prolonged neglect. Her arms and legs were painfully thin. Her skin had an unhealthy pallor from years without sunlight, and her teeth showed signs of decay from poor nutrition. Marcus had finished his call with emergency services and came over to find out what was happening. When James quietly briefed him on what Emily had revealed, Marcus's face went from disbelief to fury in seconds. He was a father of 3 daughters himself, and the thought of any child suffering like this made him physically ill. Emily continued her story. She told them that the previous night had been different. Judge Whitmore had come down to the basement room, but he was drunk. This was unusual because the judge rarely drank. He had been angry about something that happened at work, some case that had not gone the way he wanted. He had opened the hidden door and started yelling at Emily, blaming her for all his problems, saying that everything had gone wrong in his life since she had been born. In his drunken rage, he had grabbed Emily and hit her repeatedly. Victoria had been there too, and instead of stopping him, she had joined in. They had beaten the small girl until she could barely move, then thrown her back into the room and locked the door. Emily had lain on the mattress for hours, bleeding and broken, thinking that this might be the end. She thought she might die in that basement, and nobody would ever know what had happened to her. But then something had changed inside. Emily, a spark of determination that 3 years of imprisonment had not been able to extinguish, suddenly flared back to life. She decided that she would not die in that basement. She would not let them win. She would escape. And she would tell the world what Judge Harold Whitmore and his wife, Victoria, had done to her. Emily had waited until the house was quiet and she could hear her father snoring from upstairs. The beating had been so severe that Judge Whitmore had forgotten to properly secure the hidden door. It was closed, but not locked. Emily had pushed against it with all her remaining strength, and it had opened. She had crawled out of the basement room, up the basement stairs, and out through a small window that led to the backyard. The escape had taken hours because she was so weak and injured. Every movement caused her pain, but she kept going. She had one goal in mind. She would go to the courthouse. She would go to the place where her father worked, where other judges and lawyers and people who were supposed to care about justice would be. She would tell them everything, and surely someone there would help her. Emily had walked through the dark streets of the city in the early morning hours. A journey that should have taken 30 minutes but took her over 2 hours because of her injuries. She had fallen several times, each time forcing herself back to her feet and continuing forward. She had hidden in alleys when she saw police cars, afraid they might take her back to her father. She had avoided people on the street, worried they would not believe her, or worse, that they knew her father and would return her to him. When she finally saw the courthouse in the distance, with its tall columns and the royal guards standing at attention, Emily had felt a surge of hope. She knew Captain James Morrison by sight. She had seen him from the car window during the few times her father had taken her to work with him before the imprisonment. She remembered thinking that the guard looked strong and kind, someone who would protect people. She had aimed for him specifically. Using the last of her strength to reach the courthouse steps where he stood, James looked down at the brave little girl lying on the bench, and he made a decision that would change many lives forever. He believed her. Every instinct, every year of experience reading people and situations told him that Emily was telling the truth. No child could fake the kind of specific details she had provided, the genuine trauma visible in her eye, or the physical evidence of long-term abuse and neglect that covered her small body. The sound of sirens approached the courthouse, growing louder with each second. The ambulance was arriving. But James knew that just sending Emily to the hospital would not be enough. Judge Whitmore was powerful and well-connected. If he found out that Emily had escaped and told her story, he would use every resource at his disposal to discredit her, to make her seem like a confused or mentally unstable child. He might even try to regain custody of her, using his position and influence to manipulate the system he was supposed to serve. James turned to Marcus and spoke in a low, urgent voice. He told Marcus to contact the police immediately, but not the regular precinct. They needed to call the state police and specifically request detectives from the Crimes Against Children unit. They also needed to document everything. Marcus nodded in understanding and pulled out his phone to make the calls. Sarah continued to comfort Emily, holding her hand and speaking softly to her. She asked Emily if there was anyone else who might have known about her situation, anyone who might have suspected something was wrong. Emily thought for a moment, then mentioned a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who lived next door to the Whitmore house. Emily said that sometimes, late at night, when the basement window was open, just a crack, she would sing to herself quietly. Mrs. Chen had a garden that ran along the side of the Whitmore property, and Emily thought maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Chen might have heard her singing and wondered about it. The paramedics rushed into the courthouse with a stretcher and medical equipment. They were professionals who had seen many difficult cases, but even they were shocked by the condition of the small girl on the bench. As they began their assessment and prepared to transport Emily to the hospital, James pulled one of them aside. He explained briefly that this was likely a case of severe child abuse and that the perpetrator was a high-profile individual. The paramedic understood immediately and assured James that they would make sure Emily was placed under protective custody at the hospital and that all her injuries would be carefully documented with photographs and detailed medical reports within minutes. State police detectives arrived at the courthouse. James had called in a favor with a friend who worked in the Major Crimes Division. They had dispatched their best team immediately. Detective Lisa Rodriguez and her partner, Detective Mark Thompson, were experienced investigators who specialized in crimes against children. They had worked together for 8 years and had successfully prosecuted dozens of child abuse cases. Detective Rodriguez approached Emily gently. Kneeling beside the stretcher where the paramedics were preparing to move her, she introduced herself and explained that she was there to help Emily and to make sure she was safe. She asked Emily if she felt strong enough to answer a few quick questions before going to the hospital. Emily nodded weakly. In a voice that was growing fainter, Emily repeated her story for the detectives. She gave them her address, described the layout of the house, and told them exactly where to find the hidden basement room. She also mentioned that her father kept a journal in his study, locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. She had seen him writing in it, sometimes before she was imprisoned, and she had heard him talking to Victoria about keeping records of everything in case anyone ever questioned their version of events. Detective Thompson was already on his phone, coordinating with other units. They needed to secure the Whitmore residence immediately before any evidence could be destroyed. They also needed to locate Judge Whitmore and his wife Victoria and bring them in for questioning. It was a delicate situation because of the judge's position, but the evidence in Emily's testimony were compelling enough to justify immediate action. As the paramedics lifted the stretcher to transport Emily to the ambulance, she reached out and grabbed James's hand. She looked at him with that one visible eye and whispered a thank you. She thanked him for believing her, for not turning her away, for being the kind and strong person she had remembered from those brief glimpses years ago. James felt tears prick his eyes, something that rarely happened to the stoic guard. He squeezed her small hand gently and promised her that everything would be all right now. He told her she was safe, and that the people who hurt her would answer for what they had done. The ambulance pulled away from the courthouse with lights, flashing and sirens wailing. Inside the grand entrance hall, a flurry of activity continued. Detective Rodriguez was organizing her team, assigning roles, and establishing a timeline for the investigation. She sent one team to the Whitmore residence to secure the scene and search for evidence. She sent another team to locate and interview the neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She personally would go to the hospital to take a formal statement from Emily once the doctors had stabilized her. Condition Marcus had sealed off the area where Emily had been lying, treating it as part of the crime scene. The drops of blood she had left on the courthouse steps and floor would be documented and preserved as evidence. Every detail mattered in a case like this. James returned to his post at the courthouse entrance, yet his mind was far from his usual duties. He kept thinking about Emily, about her courage and determination. A child who had endured 3 years of imprisonment and abuse had found the strength to escape and seek help. She had walked for hours through the city, injured and afraid, driven by a will to survive and a hope for justice that had never been completely broken. News of the situation began to spread through the courthouse. Judges, lawyers, and court staff whispered to each other in hallways and offices. Nobody wanted to believe that one of their own, a respected judge known for his strict stance on crime, could be capable of such horrific acts. But the evidence was mounting, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, Detective Rodriguez's team had entered the Whitmore residence with a search warrant. What they found there would shock even these experienced investigators. The house from the outside looked perfect. A beautiful home in an expensive neighborhood with manicured lawns and flower gardens. But inside, behind closed doors, it held dark secrets. The team found the hidden basement room exactly where Emily had described it. The small, cold concrete space with its thin mattress and bucket was photographed extensively. The soundproofing materials on the walls were documented. The investigators could see scratch marks on the door where Emily had desperately tried to escape over the years. They found strands of her hair, traces of her blood, and other evidence that would prove beyond any doubt that someone had been imprisoned there for an extended period. In Judge Whitmore's study, they found the journal Emily had mentioned. The bottom drawer of his desk was locked, but they had the authority to open it. Inside was a leather-bound book filled with the judge's handwriting. As the investigators began to read the entries, they realized they had found something extraordinary. Judge Whitmore had documented everything. Perhaps it was arrogance, or perhaps it was some twisted need to justify his actions to himself. But he had written detailed accounts of his treatment of Emily, his reasons for imprisoning her, and his thoughts about what he called his discipline methods. The journal was a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. In his own handwriting, Judge Harold Whitmore had created a detailed confession of his crimes. The entries began innocuously enough, with complaints about Emily's behavior and his frustration with what he perceived as her rejection of Victoria. But as the pages progressed, the entries became darker and more disturbing. He wrote about the decision to imprison Emily, justifying it as a necessary correction method. He documented the construction of the hidden room, noting that he had done most of the work himself to avoid anyone knowing about it. He recorded Emily's reactions, her pleas, her tears, and her eventual resignation to her situation. Most chilling of all, he wrote about how he felt no guilt about his actions. He believed he was teaching Emily an important lesson about obedience and respect. While the search team worked at the Whitmore residence, another unit located Judge Whitmore himself. He was at the courthouse, preparing for a morning session in his courtroom. When the state police detectives approached him and informed him that they needed to speak with him about his daughter Emily, his face went pale. He tried to maintain his composure, asking what this was about in an authoritative tone, but his hands were shaking. The detectives asked him to accompany them to the station for questioning. When Judge Whitmore demanded to know the charges, Detective Thompson calmly informed him that his daughter had been found injured and had made serious allegations about her treatment at home. The judge's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed to be calculating his options. Then his lawyer instincts kicked in, and he requested to call his attorney before answering any questions. Victoria Whitmore was located at a spa across town, enjoying a morning of beauty treatments. When the police arrived and informed her that she needed to come with them for questioning regarding Emily, she initially tried to act confused, claiming she had no idea what they were talking about. But when the officers mentioned that Emily had been found and was currently at the hospital telling investigators everything, Victoria's facade cracked. She became hostile and defensive, making statements that would later be used against her in court. At the hospital, Emily was receiving the medical care she desperately needed. The doctors were shocked by the extent of her injuries and the signs of long-term malnutrition and neglect. Beyond the fresh wounds from the recent beating, they found evidence of multiple old fractures that had healed improperly. dental problems from years of poor nutrition and lack of care, and severe vitamin deficiencies. Her growth had been stunted, and she was significantly smaller than a healthy 9-year-old should be. A child psychologist was called in to evaluate Emily, and to be present during her formal interview with Detective Rodriguez. The psychologist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was experienced in working with traumatized children. She spent time with Emily, building trust and ensuring that the child felt safe before any detailed questioning began. Dr. Mitchell would later testify that in her 30 years of practice, she had rarely encountered a child who had endured so much yet maintained such a strong will to survive. When Emily was stable enough to give her full statement, Detective Rodriguez sat with her in a private hospital room with Dr. Mitchell present for support. The interview was recorded with Emily's consent. Over the course of 2 hours, Emily told her complete story, answering questions calmly and providing details that only someone who had lived through the experience could know. She talked about the passage of time in the basement, how she had counted days by the meals delivered to her until she lost track after the first year. She described the cold that never left the concrete room, the darkness during the long hours when the single light bulb was turned off, and the sounds of normal family life happening in the house above her. While she suffered alone below, Emily also revealed something that made the case even more tragic. She told him about her older brother Thomas, who had run away 5 years earlier. She said that Thomas had tried to protect her from Victoria's initial abuse. He had confronted their father about Victoria's behavior, but Judge Whitmore had refused to listen. One night, after a particularly bad incident where Victoria had locked Emily in a closet for hours, Thomas had told his father that he would report the abuse to the school authorities. The next morning, Thomas was gone. The official story was that he had run away, and despite searches and missing person reports, he had never been found. Emily believed that something bad had happened to Thomas. She said that the day before Thomas disappeared, Victoria had told her father that Thomas was becoming a problem that needed to be permanently solved. Emily had been very young at the time, only 5 years old, but she remembered feeling terrified by the way Victoria had said those words. Now, the investigators wondered if Thomas's disappearance was connected to the abuse Emily had suffered. Had he truly run away, or had something more sinister occurred? Detective Rodriguez immediately opened a cold case investigation into Thomas Whitmore's disappearance. She assigned a team to re-examine all the evidence from the original missing person case and to search the Whitmore property more thoroughly. If there was even a chance that Thomas had been harmed, they needed to find out the truth. Back at the courthouse, James Morrison found himself unable to focus on his duties. He kept thinking about Emily and wondering how the investigation was progressing. During his lunch break, he called the hospital and asked about Emily's condition. The staff could not give him detailed information due to privacy regulations, but they confirmed that she was stable and receiving good care. That small reassurance helped ease some of his worry. The story of Emily's rescue was beginning to leak to the media. Although the police were trying to control the information to protect the integrity of the investigation, by late afternoon, news vans were parked outside the courthouse and the Whitmore residence. Reporters were desperately trying to get any information they could about the allegations against the respected judge. The legal community was in shock. Lawyers who had worked with Judge Whitmore for years could not reconcile the man they knew, the stern but fair jurist who seemed dedicated to justice, with the monster Emily described. Some refused to believe the allegations, insisting there must be some mistake or misunderstanding. Others remembered small details that now seemed suspicious in hindsight. One lawyer recalled that Judge Whitmore never spoke about his daughter Emily, even though most parents love to share stories about their children. Another remembered that the judge had become increasingly isolated after his second marriage, declining social invitations and keeping his personal life completely separate from his professional one. At the police station, Judge Whitmore sat in an interrogation room with his high-priced defense attorney. He had invoked his right to remain silent and refused to answer any questions, but the investigators did not need his confession. They had Emily's testimony, the physical evidence from the house, the journal, and a growing list of supporting witnesses. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had indeed heard strange sounds from the Whitmore property over the years. She had heard what she thought might be singing or crying late at night, sounds that seemed to come from underground. She had even called the police once to report it, but when officers had visited the Whitmore home, the judge had explained it away as sounds from his television or radio. The officers had accepted his explanation and left. Mrs. Chen had always felt guilty about not pushing harder, about not trusting her instincts that something was wrong. Other neighbors came forward with their own observations. A mailman reported that he had noticed the Whitmore household never seemed to receive any mail for Emily. No birthday cards or letters, which he had found odd. A former housekeeper who had worked for the family, briefly before being abruptly fired, said that she had been forbidden from entering certain areas of the basement, and that Victoria had always been present during her shifts, watching her constantly. The housekeeper had thought it was strange at the time, but had needed the job too much to ask questions. The evidence continued to mount. Forensic teams found Emily's fingerprints and DNA throughout the hidden basement room. They found evidence that Victoria had regularly purchased just enough extra food to keep one additional person alive at minimum sustenance levels. Financial records showed that Judge Whitmore had made cash withdrawals every month that could not be accounted for in the family's regular expenses. Money that had likely been used to maintain Emily's imprisonment without creating a paper trail. As the sun set on that remarkable Tuesday, Emily lay in her hospital bed, finally safe for the first time in 3 years. Despite her injuries and exhaustion, she felt a sense of peace. She had done it. She had escaped. She had told her story, and people had believed her. The nightmare was not over yet. She knew there would be trials and testimonies and difficult days ahead, but the worst was behind her. The investigation into Thomas Whitmore's disappearance took a dark turn on the 3rd day after Emily's rescue. A cadaver dog brought to search the extensive property behind the Whitmore house alerted to an area in the back corner of the yard, near an old garden shed that had long been abandoned and overgrown with weeds. Detective Rodriguez felt her stomach drop as she watched the forensic team carefully excavate the area. 3 feet below the surface, they found remains that would later be identified through dental records as Thomas Whitmore. The 15-year-old boy had not run away from home 5 years ago, as everyone had believed. He had been murdered and buried in his own backyard. His family had maintained the lie all these years. The discovery changed everything. What had been a case of child abuse and imprisonment now included murder. The medical examiner determined that Thomas had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and the injury patterns were consistent with being struck by a heavy object. As investigators processed this new crime scene, they found additional evidence buried with Thomas. A metal baseball bat still stained with blood after all these years, and a torn piece of fabric that matched a shirt Victoria had been photographed wearing in family photos from that time period. When confronted with the evidence of Thomas's murder, Judge Whitmore's carefully constructed composure finally shattered completely. His attorney tried to stop him from speaking, but the judge began talking, perhaps needing to confess after years of carrying the terrible secret. He admitted that Thomas had been killed, but he claimed it had been an accident. According to his statement, Thomas had confronted Victoria about her treatment of Emily one evening when the judge was working late. The argument had escalated, and Victoria had struck Thomas with the baseball bat in what Whitmore described as self-defense. When the judge came home and found his son dead, he had made the decision to cover up the crime rather than lose his wife and his reputation. Together, Judge Whitmore and Victoria had buried Thomas in the backyard that same night. They had then reported him as a runaway, playing the role of concerned parents while secretly knowing their son lay dead beneath the ground just meters from their house. The judge had used his connections in law enforcement to ensure the investigation into Thomas's disappearance remained superficial. He had suggested theories about Thomas running away to join friends in another state, and the investigators had followed those false leads while the real evidence remained. Buried in the yard, Emily was informed about Thomas's fate gently by Dr. Mitchell, the child psychologist. The young girl cried for hours, mourning the brother she had always hoped might return someday to save her. But in a strange way, the discovery also brought her a sense of closure. She had always felt that something terrible had happened to Thomas. Now she knew the truth, as painful as it was. She also understood that she had been incredibly lucky to survive an escape. Her father and Victoria had already proven they were capable of murder. There was no telling what might have eventually happened to her if she had not found the courage to flee that morning. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and conclusive. With the overwhelming evidence against them, both Judge Harold Whitmore and Victoria Whitmore faced multiple serious charges, including murder, child abuse, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice. The prosecution presented Emily's testimony, the journal, the forensic evidence from the basement room, the neighbors' statements, and the evidence from Thomas's burial site. The defense had no realistic way to counter such comprehensive proof of guilt. Victoria attempted to claim that she had been acting under the judge's control, that he had manipulated and threatened her into participating in the abuse. But investigators found evidence that she had been an eager participant and, in some cases, the instigator of the cruelty toward both children. Text messages and emails between Victoria and her friends revealed her true nature. She had complained to confidants about how much she disliked her stepchildren and wished they would simply disappear. After Thomas's death, she had joked in a message to a friend about how much quieter the house had become. The trial attracted national media attention. A judge who had sentenced countless criminals now stood as a defendant in a courtroom, facing the very justice system he had once served. The irony was not lost on anyone. Legal experts analyzed every aspect of the case on television. Child welfare advocates used the case to highlight gaps in the system that had allowed Emily's imprisonment to go undetected for 3 years. How had a child simply vanished from school, from doctor's appointments, from society, without anyone raising serious alarms? Investigators discovered that Judge Whitmore and Victoria created an elaborate story to explain Emily's absence from school and public life. They had told school administrators that Emily had developed severe behavioral problems and had been enrolled in a specialized private boarding school in another state for children with emotional difficulties. They had provided forged documents from a fictitious institution. And because of Judge Whitmore's position and reputation, no one had questioned the story too deeply. The school had accepted the withdrawal without conducting a home visit or verifying the new school's credentials. Emily's pediatrician had been told a similar story, and routine checkup appointments had been canceled with explanations about Emily receiving medical care at her new school. Again, because of who Judge Whitmore was. The doctor's office had not pushed for more information or reported the situation to Child Protective Services. The system had failed Emily at multiple points, trusting the word of a respected judge over the safety protocols that should have protected a vulnerable child. During the trial, Emily had to testify. Despite being only 9 years old and having endured unimaginable trauma, she took the witness stand with remarkable courage. The courtroom was silent as she answered the prosecutor's questions in a clear, steady voice. She described her 3 years in the basement, the beatings, the isolation, and the fear. She talked about her brother Thomas and how much she missed him. She looked directly at her father and Victoria as she spoke, no longer afraid of them. Judge Whitmore could not meet his daughter's eyes. He stared at the table in front of him, his face gray and expressionless. Victoria, however, glared at Emily with open hatred, even in front of the jury. That look of contempt would be one of the factors that sealed her fate. The jury could see that she felt no remorse, no shame, only anger at being caught. James Morrison attended every day of the trial. He sat in the public gallery, still in his Royal Guard uniform during his off hours. Wanting to support Emily and see justice served, he had formed a special bond with the brave little girl who had stumbled into his life that Tuesday morning. Emily would often look for him in the courtroom, and his presence gave her strength. When she was scared or overwhelmed, she would find his face in the crowd, and he would give her an encouraging nod. The defense attorneys tried their best to create doubt, to suggest that Emily's memories might be confused or exaggerated, to paint Judge Whitmore as a strict but well-meaning father whose discipline methods had been misunderstood, but the physical evidence was impossible to refute. The hidden room, the journal, Thomas's body in the backyard, all of it pointed to deliberate, calculated cruelty and evil. After 3 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Judge Harold Whitmore was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder of Thomas, false imprisonment of Emily, child abuse, and multiple other charges. Victoria Whitmore was also found guilty on all counts, including being an accessory to Thomas's murder and active participation in Emily's abuse. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. The judge presiding over the case, a colleague who had known Harold Whitmore for years, spoke about the betrayal of public trust and the abuse of power. He noted that Judge Whitmore had been entrusted with upholding justice and protecting the innocent. Yet he had committed some of the most heinous crimes imaginable against his own children. The sentence reflected the severity of the crimes. Judge Harold Whitmore was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Thomas. With additional consecutive sentences for the other crimes totaling another 50 years, Victoria received a similar sentence. As the former judge was led away in handcuffs, he finally looked at Emily, who was sitting in the front row between James Morrison and Dr. Mitchell. For just a moment, something that might have been regret flickered across his face. But it was too late for regret, too late for apologies. The man who had once worn the robes of justice now wore the orange jumpsuit of a convicted criminal. After the trial ended, Emily faced the challenge of rebuilding her life. She had no family left who could care for her. Her maternal grandparents had passed away years ago, and her paternal relatives wanted nothing to do with the scandal. She was placed in foster care, but finding the right home for a child with such severe trauma was difficult. During this uncertain time, James Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He and his wife, Margaret, had raised 3 children who were now adults with families of their own. They had often talked about becoming foster parents once James retired from his guard duties, but seeing Emily struggling to find a stable home, James decided he could not wait for retirement. He and Margaret applied to become Emily's foster parents, with the possibility of adoption if everything went well. The process was rigorous. Social workers conducted extensive background checks, home visits, and interviews. They wanted to ensure that Emily would be placed in a safe, loving environment where she could heal and grow. James and Margaret passed every evaluation with flying colors. They had a strong marriage, financial stability, experience raising children, and most importantly, a genuine love and concern for Emily's well-being. 6 months after the trial ended, Emily moved into the Morrison home. It was a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood with a large backyard and a tree swing. Margaret had prepared a bedroom for Emily, painting it in soft colors and filling it with books, toys, and everything a young girl might need. But they had also been careful not to overwhelm her. They understood that after years of deprivation, too much too soon might be frightening rather than comforting. The adjustment was not easy. Emily had nightmares almost every night. She was afraid of the dark and needed a nightlight. She hoarded food in her room at first, a behavior born from years of near starvation. She flinched when people moved too quickly near her. She had trouble trusting adults and would often test boundaries to see if James and Margaret would hurt her or send her away when she misbehaved. But James and Margaret were patient and understanding. They had been thoroughly trained in trauma-informed care, and they worked closely with Dr. Mitchell and other therapists to help Emily heal. They established routines that made Emily feel safe. Every morning, James would knock on her door and wait for her to invite him in before entering. Every night, Margaret would sit with Emily and read her stories until she fell asleep. They never raised their voices in anger, never threatened punishment, and always followed through on their promises. Slowly, week by week, Emily began to trust them. The nightmares became less frequent. She stopped hoarding food when she realized that meals would always be provided regularly. She started to smile, then to laugh. She made friends at her new school where the teachers had been briefed on her situation and provided extra support. She joined a soccer team and discovered she loved running in the open air after years of confinement. Dr. Mitchell continued to work with Emily weekly, helping her process her trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. The psychologist was amazed by Emily's resilience. Many children who suffered less severe abuse struggled for years or even decades to recover. But Emily had something special inside her, a core of strength that had kept her alive during her darkest days and now helped her embrace her new life with remarkable courage. 1 year after moving in with the Morrisons, Emily stood in a courtroom again. But this time, It was a happy occasion. The adoption proceedings were being finalized. James and Margaret were officially becoming her parents, and she was officially becoming Emily Morrison. The judge, a kind woman who had followed Emily's story and admired her bravery, smiled warmly as she signed the papers. Emily looked different from the broken, a terrified child who had stumbled up the courthouse steps that Tuesday morning. She had gained healthy weight. Her hair was shiny and neatly braided, and her face glowed with happiness. Most remarkably, both her eyes were visible and bright with life. The swelling and bruises had long since healed, leaving only faint scars that would fade with time. After the adoption ceremony, it was a small celebration at the Morrison home. James's adult children came with their spouses and kids, welcoming Emily as their new sister and aunt. Neighbors who had watched Emily's transformation over the past year brought food and gifts. Detective Rodriguez attended, bringing a framed certificate declaring Emily an honorary junior detective for her bravery in seeking justice. Even Sarah, the security officer who had helped treat Emily's wounds that first day, came to celebrate. Emily stood in the backyard, watching the children play and the adults talk and laugh. She felt overwhelmed with gratitude and joy. A year ago, she had been locked in a dark basement with no hope of ever experiencing a normal life. Now she had a family who loved her, friends who accepted her, and a future full of possibilities. James came to stand beside her, and Emily reached up to take his hand. She looked up at him. This tall, strong man who had been the first person to truly see her and believe her when she needed help most. She thanked him again, not just for that day at the courthouse, but for everything he and Margaret had done since then. James knelt down so he was at eye level with Emily. He told her that she did not need to thank him. He said that she had saved herself through her own courage and determination. He had simply been in the right place at the right time to help. But Emily insisted. She said that without him, she might not have made it up those courthouse steps. She might have collapsed on the street where no one would have listened to her story. He had not only saved her life that day, but he had given her a new life, a better life, a life worth living. As the celebration continued around them, Emily asked James about something that had been on her mind. She asked if he ever regretted breaking protocol that day, leaving his post to help her. James smiled and told her it was the easiest decision he had ever made. He said that in 20 years of standing guard at that courthouse, he had seen thousands of people seeking justice. But Emily was the only one who had taught him the true meaning of courage and resilience. She had reminded him why he had chosen to serve, protect in the first place. Emily's story became known far beyond their city. News articles and television programs featured her case, always protecting her identity but sharing her message of hope and survival. Child welfare organizations used her experience to push for reforms in the system. Schools implemented better protocols for verifying a child's whereabouts when they withdrew. Medical offices were required to follow up more aggressively when patients, especially children, disappeared from care. Judges and lawyers received training on recognizing potential abuse, even in families that seemed respectable on the surface. The hidden room in the Whitmore basement was photographed extensively and then sealed permanently. The house itself was eventually sold, and the new owners, a young couple with no knowledge of its dark history, turned it into a warm family home. They painted over the walls, tore out the basement modifications, and filled the spaces with light and love. In a way, it felt like an exorcism of the evil that had once resided there. Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who had heard Emily singing, became one of Emily's strongest supporters. She visited the Morrison home regularly, bringing homemade dumplings and teaching Emily about her Chinese heritage and culture. Mrs. Chen told Emily that she would always regret not pushing harder when she heard those strange sounds. But Emily assured her that it was not her fault. The blame belonged solely to the people who had committed the crimes, not to those who had been deceived by them. As Emily grew older, she remained close with the Morrison family. She excelled in school, showing a particular aptitude for creative writing. She began writing poetry and short stories, using her art to process her experiences and to give voice to other children who had suffered in silence. Her teachers encouraged her talent, and by the time she was in high school, she had won several writing competitions. Emily also became an advocate for child abuse survivors. She volunteered with organizations that supported children in foster care and spoke at conferences about her experiences. She never hid from her past, but she also did not let it define her entire identity. She was more than a victim or a survivor. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a writer, and a young woman with dreams and goals for the future. James Morrison eventually retired from his position as a royal guard at the courthouse. At his retirement ceremony, he was honored for his decades of service and dedication. But when he gave his speech, he talked mostly about Emily and how she had changed his life. He said that in all his years of protecting the courthouse and the justice system it represented, the most important thing he had ever done was to run toward a crying child in need. That single act of compassion had rippled outward, touching countless lives and bringing a monster to justice. The courthouse where James had served for so long installed a small plaque near the entrance. Though it did not mention Emily by name to protect her privacy, the plaque simply read, "True justice begins with compassion for the most vulnerable among us." Those who knew the story understood its meaning. It served as a reminder to everyone who passed through those doors that justice was not just about laws and procedures, but about protecting those who could not protect themselves. Years passed, and Emily grew into a confident young woman. She graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to study psychology and social work at university. She wanted to dedicate her life to helping other children who had experienced trauma, to be for them what Dr. Mitchell and the Morrisons had been for her. On the anniversary of her rescue each year, Emily would return to the courthouse with James. They would stand at the spot where he had caught her as she fell all those years ago. Emily would place a single white flower on the steps in memory of her brother Thomas, the sibling she had lost but would never forget. Then she and James would sit on a nearby bench and talk about how far she had come and what the future held. During one of these annual visits, when Emily was in her early 20s and about to graduate from university, a young mother approached them. She had a small boy with her, perhaps 7 years old, who was clinging to her hand nervously. The woman introduced herself and explained that she had seen Emily speak at a conference about child advocacy. The woman said she had been in an abusive relationship and her son had witnessed violence in their home. Hearing Emily's story had given her the courage to leave and seek help. She wanted to thank Emily for sharing her experience and inspiring others to break free from abuse. Emily hugged the woman and knelt down to speak gently to the shy little boy. She told him that he was brave, that his mother was brave, and that their lives were going to get better. She gave him a small stuffed bear, the same kind that Margaret had given her during those early difficult days in the Morrison home. The boy clutched the bear tightly and smiled at Emily through his tears as the mother and son walked away. James put his arm around Emily's shoulders. He told her how proud he was of the woman she had become, how she had taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. Emily leaned against him, this man who had become her true father in every way that mattered. She reflected on her journey from that dark basement to this moment of hope and healing. She thought about all the people who had helped her along the way. Detective Rodriguez, Dr. Mitchell, Sarah Marcus, and most of all, James and Margaret Morrison. She thought about the system that had failed her, but eventually delivered justice. She thought about her brother Thomas, and hoped that wherever he was, he knew that their story had brought about change that would protect other children. Emily Morrison had survived the unthinkable. She had escaped from 3 years of imprisonment, walked through the city while injured and afraid, found the courage to tell her truth to a world that might not have believed her. She had watched her abusers face justice and had rebuilt her life from ashes. Most importantly, she had chosen not to let her trauma destroy her capacity for love, trust, and hope. The sun began to set over the courthouse, casting golden light across the marble steps where Emily's new life had begun. She stood up, ready to leave, ready to continue forward into whatever future awaited her. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She had learned that healing was possible, even from the deepest wounds. And she had learned that sometimes, in our darkest moments, a guardian angel appears not with wings and a halo, but with a guard's uniform and a compassionate heart willing to believe a child's desperate truth. Emily took one last look at the courthouse. the place where her nightmare had ended and her real life had begun, then walked away hand in hand with James. Ready to help write new stories of hope and survival for others who still suffered in silence?